Good morning, everyone. How is everybody doing today? All right. Today's talk is called Why Monogamy Matters. 10 years ago this past June, as I'm sure many of you remember, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage across the United States. This was a day of great celebration and rejoicing among everyone who had been advocating for this cause for many years. Now, as I'm sure you also remember, in the years leading up to marriage equality, many opponents of same-sex marriage had predicted that legalizing it would usher in what they called the slippery slope, that it would lead to the normalization of a wide range of previously taboo practices. Here are some of the high-profile slippery slope predictions that were made. In 2005, Bill O'Reilly said, in 10 years, this is going to be a totally different country. You'll be able to marry a goat. You mark my words. James Dobson said, how about group marriage? Or marriage between daddies and little girls? Or marriage between a man and his donkey? And then he said that was his prediction. So pretty confident predictions here. Congressman Louis Gohmert said, when you say it's not a man and a woman anymore, then why not have 3 men and 1 woman? Or 4 women and 1 man? Or why not somebody has a love for an animal? Pat Robertson also honed in on the animal issue. Very popular piece of rhetoric here. What about bestiality, he said, and ultimately, what about child molestation and pedophilia? Mark my words, this is just the beginning of a long downward slide in relation to all the things that we consider to be abhorrent. Well, 10 years have passed since same-sex marriage was legalized, and fortunately, the most extreme of these slippery slope predictions have not come to pass. Incest, pedophilia, and bestiality are not normalized or even on their way to being normalized, and thank goodness for that. But not only have these slippery slope predictions, the most radical of them, not come to pass, but same-sex marriage has also had many documented benefits. The Research Institute RAND last year conducted a review of 96 empirical studies about the impact of same-sex marriage, and they concluded that it had the following benefits for same-sex couples. It led to more stable relationships, higher earnings, higher rates of homeownership. It led to lower rates of substance abuse, to lower psychological distress for married versus unmarried same-sex couples, fewer sexual orientation, hate crimes, and employment discrimination, and better academic performance for the children of same-sex couples, and increased rates of adoption. So those are some pretty significant positive effects for same-sex couples and their families. And Rand also found that same-sex marriage had not negatively affected heterosexual marriage. They found no evidence of an increase in divorce because of same-sex marriage, of cohabitation, of unmarried heterosexual couples. And they said there was no evidence of a negative shift in attitudes toward the institution of marriage overall. So, the most extreme slippery slope predictions have not come to pass. Same-sex marriage has had profound benefits for same-sex couples and their families, and it has not harmed heterosexual marriages. So, what is there to complain about? Well, one area of slippery slope predictions that conservatives have felt increasingly vindicated about relates to the issue of monogamy. Now, to be clear, there is no organized political movement to legalize polygamy, and I don't think that there will be one anytime soon. But as I'll show on the next slide, public support for various forms of non-monogamy has grown considerably over the last 10 years. And that erosion of what had been previously a broad cultural consensus in favor of monogamy is part of what many conservatives had feared during the same-sex marriage debate. And in fact, none other than the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts himself raised this issue in his dissent to the 2015 Obergefell ruling legalizing same-sex marriage. At the time, he wrote, "It is striking how much of the majority's reasoning would apply with equal force to the claim of a fundamental right to plural marriage." So, was he correct? Does the logic of accepting same-sex marriage inevitably lead to accepting at least some forms of polygamy or non-monogamy? Well, I would say that the answer to that question depends on what logic persuaded someone to support same-sex marriage in the first place. It can be easy to forget, but there were a variety of arguments in favor of same-sex marriage, and some of them had clearer limiting principles than others. I would say there were three main categories of arguments in favor of same-sex marriage. There was a conservative argument, a liberal argument, and a liberationist argument. The conservative argument for same-sex marriage was a pro-marriage argument. The argument was that marriage is good, that love, commitment, monogamy, and stability are good for all people in all families, gay and straight, and that is why same-sex marriage should be legalized. So the logic of this does not lead to non-monogamy because part of the point of it is that monogamy is good. Then there was a liberal argument for same-sex marriage that was compatible with the conservative argument, but with a different emphasis. This was an emphasis on equal rights. The argument was that gay people deserve equal rights. Marriage is a fundamental right. Therefore, gay people deserve the right to get married. I agree with both of those arguments. But there was also a third stream of argumentation in support of same-sex marriage that I would call the liberationist argument. This was the idea that the reason why same-sex marriage should be legal is because really, society should take at least a neutral, if not a positive view of all sexual acts between consenting adults. Today, this often goes under the banner of sex positivity. And the idea is all consenting acts between adults should be viewed as acceptable. There should be no taboos around any consensual sex among adults in society. This is taking the love is love idea to its most literal and extreme endpoint. And many people who have this perspective don't even really think that marriage should be put on a pedestal at all. It shouldn't really be given special recognition and rights by the state because that would suggest that less committed relationships don't deserve the same kind of recognition. But many of them were still willing to support same-sex marriage, occasionally begrudgingly, because it at least was expanding the scope of relationships that the state was willing to confer legitimacy upon. Well, the liberationist argument is very different from the conservative argument in particular. And so while the conservative argument does not logically lead to acceptance of non-monogamy, the liberationist argument absolutely does. And in fact, we have seen the liberationist argument and that whole philosophy of sex positivity gain ground in the 10 years since same-sex marriage was legalized. Now, to be clear, I don't think it's fair to say that same-sex marriage itself caused this. I think it's more correct to say that the liberationist philosophy that caused some people to support same-sex marriage has continued on, and that this is the fruit of that perspective. So here are some of the statistics. In 2001, only 7% of Americans, basically no one, said that they thought that polygamy was morally acceptable. As of this year, the number has tripled to 21%. Support for open marriages is even higher. A full third of Americans now say they believe open marriages are acceptable. And one reason this is particularly concerning to many conservatives is when you look at the generational divides. Among younger people, among adults under 30, it is a full majority, 51%, that now say that open marriages are acceptable. Polyamory also has significant, not quite as high, but significant support. 29% of Americans now approve, including 41% of adults under 30. And then some people will look at these numbers and say, okay, but what is this really going to affect? Because most people are not going to be practicing non-monogamy. They're really just deciding to be less judgmental toward other people and isn't actually that kind of a good thing. A lot of people will say something to the effect of, look, I don't have an issue with non-monogamy, but I also don't have the time for it, right? And so I just don't have the energy for that. If other people want to do that, that's great. I support them. My dance book, whatever that phrase is from the 50s that I was too young to know, is full. Dance card, that's it, thank you. Okay. But in fact, surveys suggest that the number of people who would be interested in pursuing non-monogamy if this becomes more accepted is actually quite a bit higher than many people assume. A full third of Americans, 34%, now say that their ideal relationship would not be completely monogamous. This is a significant increase from just 10 years ago when only 14% of Americans said that they would even consider an open relationship. And once again, among the younger cohorts, and particularly among men under 45, 55% would prefer a non-monogamous relationship. Now, admittedly, these numbers are still primarily aspirational because only 12% of Americans actually say that they have engaged in an open sexual relationship. And depending on the survey, between 3 and 7% say that they are currently in one. And interestingly, twice as many men have pursued non-monogamy as women, and this is a point that will recur and that we will keep seeing here in the data. So this is a significant shift in cultural attitudes. It's not a majority of the country yet, but there has been a statistical increase that is meaningful in support for non-monogamy. And this has led some opponents of same-sex marriage to say that their slippery slope concerns, maybe not all of them, but at least some of them, have now been validated. Earlier this year, looking at data like this, the evangelical theologian Michael Bird wrote, "I think the slippery slope arguments against same-sex marriage are now validated. Once same-sex marriage was legalized, the only argument against polygamy became aesthetic. I think it's weird, but that is not a legal argument." And then on the flip side, some supporters of non-monogamy have actually said the exact same thing. They've said, well, in this respect, actually, the slippery slope from same-sex marriage was real, but it's a good thing. So this is a common meme that's shared by many, especially more conservative people who despair of some of these cultural trends. Step 1, it's not really happening. Step 2, yeah, it's happening, but it's not a big deal. Step 3, it's a good thing, actually. Step 4, people freaking out about it are the real problem. So, is non-monogamy a good thing, actually? And are people freaking out about it actually the real problem? Well, to answer that question, we need to have a better understanding of what specifically consensual non-monogamy is, which is an important distinction from non-consensual or secretive non-monogamy, where one partner is not aware of what the other partner is doing. So, there's a wide range of consensually non-monogamous configurations. It is not just one thing. Jessica Fern is a popular author on polyamory. In her book, Polysecure, she has this chart here of a number of different non-monogamous relationship structures and possibilities. Some of the main ones are open marriages or relationships. These typically involve a primary romantic and sexual relationship, but where the partners agree to have typically sexual relationships with people on the side, but not typically dating or romantic relationships with people on the side. This has been called monogamish by Dan Savage. Then there is polyamory, which tends to be the pursuit of multiple romantic and sexual relationships at the same time. So falling in love with multiple people simultaneously and dating or being with in long-term romantic committed relationships with multiple people simultaneously. Polyamory also is not just one thing. There are many different ways that it can be structured. There's hierarchical polyamory, where people may have a primary partner, but could also have secondary and even tertiary partners, which often does become a scheduling issue. Then there is non-hierarchical polyamory, and a common form of non-hierarchical polyamory is something like a closed throuple. So you have 3 people who are all in a relationship with one another, they're all committed to one another, any type of closed polycule. There can be 4 people in a quad. There's really no limit on the possible number other than practicality. Now, an important point to note here too is that while polyamory can be adopted as an identity, there are certainly people who identify as polyamorous, and everybody deserves to be treated with kindness and respect regardless of their beliefs or their identity. Polyamory is not a sexual orientation. And this distinction can be illustrated quite simply in that there are people who are only capable of falling in love with someone of the same sex. There are people who are only capable of falling in love with someone of the opposite sex. There are no people who are only capable of falling in love with multiple people at the same time. So polyamory is a preference that some people have, and it is a chosen relationship structure, and that is an important distinction when we're considering this, especially as it relates to questions of sexual orientation and same-sex marriage. The most popular book making the case for non-monogamy and polyamory is The Ethical Slut by authors Janet Hardy and Dossie Easton. And their motto in this book is quite simply, sex is nice and pleasure is good for you. And they say explicitly that their vision is one of utopia. They say, rather optimistically, our programming about love, intimacy, and sex can be rewritten. They acknowledge that jealousy can be an issue in pursuing non-monogamy, but that we can overcome this. And their vision, they say, is that we would like to live in a culture that respects the choices made by sluts, a term they've sought to reclaim, as highly as we respect the couple celebrating their 50th anniversary. Well, this is a pretty different attitude than what most people have, and it's certainly a very different attitude than pretty much all Christians have, but this is their perspective. Another popular book advocating for non-monogamy is called More Than Two by Eve Rickert and Andrea Zanin. And this book, I think, is a bit more sober-minded about the challenges of non-monogamy just from a practical standpoint. They say non-monogamy is not utopia, so the opposite message. When you have more than two people involved in your romantic life, things get complicated fast. And they do support non-monogamy, but they also acknowledge that it means giving things up. People don't always get along, they say, and you might hate it. Non-monogamy and polyamory have been receiving increased mainstream media visibility and attention in recent years. Last year, there was a high-profile memoir of an open marriage by Molly Roden-Winter, a mother and wife in Brooklyn. And her motto, she said, was, "You should have a full self. You shouldn't have to give yourself up to be a mother." And for her, not giving herself up meant not being limited to a monogamous relationship with her husband. The New York Times also last year profiled a 20-person polycule in the Boston area. And this polycule said that they were seeking to reflect, quote, radical queer values. Now, this can be a little bit confusing because many people in this polycule are heterosexual. They're not using the word queer in the sense of gay or bisexual, but rather in the queer theory sense of everything that is against norms. Anything that is going against a social norm is therefore queer in this academic field of queer theory, and it's commonly used that way now by some people, which creates a lot of confusion, and also then can make people look at this polycule and think, oh, well, this is what the gays are up to, when in fact, many of these people are actually heterosexual. So what relevance does this entire conversation have for Christians and the church? Well, there are now some in the church who are making the case that the church itself should bless and support non-monogamy. The most high-profile example is probably Brandon Robertson, who is a progressive Christian author and pastor who has a large TikTok following. And he has said, "For those who are in an open or polyamorous relationship, your relationships are holy. They are beautiful and welcome and celebrated." And one of his key points has been that there's just nothing harmful about it. What is the moral harm of an open relationship? He says, can't name it. What is the moral harm of polyamory? Also, when it comes to the Bible and theology, Robertson and other advocates of non-monogamy in the church often point to the fact that polygamy was practiced in the Old Testament by over 20 men, including many of the most revered figures, like Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon. And it's true, these men are never condemned for the practice of polygamy itself, nor does Scripture explicitly prohibit polygamy. Although the New Testament, as we'll see, does describe marriage only as monogamous and also does prohibit polygamy for church leaders. But I should also note up front, well, two things. One, Robertson and other supporters of non-monogamy in the church do acknowledge that the forms of polygamy practiced in the Old Testament were problematic because they were patriarchal in nature, right? One man, many wives. But they generally argue that because most people today who embrace polyamory reject patriarchy and seek to have a mutual and egalitarian dynamic between the partners, that modern polyamory can avoid the problems that existed with patriarchal polygamy. I also should just note up front that for Christians, most of the modern non-monogamous configurations we've just reviewed are at odds with our values about sexuality for reasons that go beyond just the issue of monogamy. As people who have been bought with a price, whose bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit, engaging in casual sexual relationships of any kind is not aligned with how we are called to live as the redeemed people of God. But what about the best possible version of polyamory? A lifelong, committed relationship between 3 or more partners who all care for and support one another. If they all love each other and all treat each other well, really, what's the problem? Do we actually have good reasons not to support that kind of non-monogamous relationship beyond simply saying, I think it's weird, or it's not my personal preference? Well, as we're considering that question, it's worth remembering a principle that was famously articulated by the Christian writer G.K. Chesterton. He talked about how many social institutions and norms have a purpose that isn't immediately evident to us on the surface. And he gave this memorable visual of a fence or a gate that is across a road. And he said there are 2 types of reformers, one that actually deforms and the other that reforms. He writes, the more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to a fence and says, I don't see the use of this. Let us clear it away. To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, if you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go back and think. Then, when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it. So what Chesterton is saying is that, yes, we can make changes and social reforms, but we should be careful as we do that we don't make changes to things before we've really thought about them and understood why those norms were created in the first place, because they may have a purpose that goes beyond what we currently recognize. So here's a roadmap for the rest of this talk. First, I'm going to look at polygamy in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and then the shift in the New Testament to monogamy. Then I'm going to look at the consequences historically for societies of embracing monogamy versus polygamy. And then finally, I'd like to assess the distinct questions of polyamory and consensual non-monogamy today to see whether an egalitarian approach can avoid some of the severest problems of patriarchal polygamy. So first, polygamy in the Bible. It is true that the Bible does not explicitly condemn polygamy, and polygamy was in fact permitted in the Old Testament. At the same time, there are also good reasons to view polygamy in the Old Testament as non-ideal. Genesis 2, of course, describes the first couple, Adam and Eve, as monogamous. And while there are examples of polygamy that have no stories attached to them, just so-and-so had X number of wives, every time that there is a story involving polygamy in the Old Testament, there is also serious conflict and strife that stem from the practice. I'd like to just define terms before getting into the texts. Polygamy is simply the state of having multiple spouses. Now, polygamy historically is almost always a particular form called polygyny, which is a man having multiple wives. Polyandry has occasionally, rarely been practiced historically. I'll discuss it a little bit later, and that's a woman having multiple husbands. But in the Bible, we're only looking at polygyny. And in fact, polyandry was not even permitted in the Old Testament. So I'll just say polygamy as a shorthand, but we're primarily talking about polygyny. There are three different reasons why polygamy was practiced in the Old Testament: for procreation, for status and power, and out of desperation. Now, some of these stories are just so fascinating. I could easily spend an hour talking about all of these texts, but we've got a lot to get to, so I'm going to do a fairly quick overview here. A famous story I'm sure most of you remember from Sunday school is between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Sarah is infertile, so she asks Abraham to have sex with her Egyptian slave Hagar. This ends up creating serious strife between Sarah and Hagar, and then later on, once they each have their own son with Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac, then there's conflict between the children as well, and then there's also conflict between the wives on behalf of the children. These are very common dynamics in polygamy, both in the Bible and historically. Also, very famously, you have the situation of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. Now, this wasn't originally for procreation. It was originally because Jacob got tricked into marrying the older daughter when he wanted to marry the younger daughter. And the dynamic in this marriage, when he ended up marrying them both, was not great. Jacob's love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. Rachel and Leah were constantly at loggerheads, constantly in competition with one another. And then when one couldn't have a child, then they would give their maidservant to Jacob so that she could bear a child on her behalf. And it was just this constant battle that was not presented positively in Scripture. Also in 1 Samuel 1, there's a man named Elkanah who has two wives. And once again, Peninnah and Hannah, one of them is infertile and the other is not, and this creates serious conflict. It says that Hannah's rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her, that she did this year after year, and her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her rival, Peninnah, was really quite awful to her. And here's a really interesting point. So the Hebrew term that's used here for rival is zara. And later in Rabbinic Hebrew, this became a standard term to refer to co-wives in polygamous marriages, because the term literally means trouble, distress, or affliction. So even in the early centuries AD, the Jewish rabbis still did permit polygamy, but they also acknowledged quite literally that polygamy was trouble. Most famously, when it comes to the category of polygamy for status and power, we have Solomon with his 700 wives and 300 concubines. This is also presented negatively. Now, he's not critiqued for the polygamy itself, but rather for what it led him to do, which was he married many foreign wives who worshipped other gods, and his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. So it is associated with something negative, and certainly it's being demonstrated the negative effects of polygamy here. David also had many wives. He starts with 7, according to 2 Samuel 3, and then he just keeps adding more wives and concubines. Even that's not enough. He lusts after Bathsheba quite infamously. Now, one argument that's sometimes made is, aha, wait, we do have a positive example of polygamy in the Bible. and that's David's marriage to Abigail. And it is true that David's marriage with Abigail is presented positively in the Old Testament. The problem is that's just one piece of David's broader polygamous complex. And so it can't be assessed in isolation. One of the biggest problems with polygamy, it's not that it's impossible for a man to have a loving relationship with one of his wives or multiple of his wives. It certainly is possible. One of the biggest problems with it, though, is that polygamy creates serious conflict between the children of different mothers who are then jockeying for position and power, especially as they age. And this conflict is illustrated quite dramatically in the story of David's household, where you have the son of one of David's wives who rapes the daughter of a different one of David's wives, and then the brother of that same other wife is so outraged on his sister's behalf that he ends up killing the rapist half-brother, and seems to be so upset with how David handled this situation that he leads an uprising against David that leads with 20,000 Israelite men dead on the battlefield. And that's not even the end of the story, because upon David's death, Solomon, the son of Bathsheba and David, is supposed to succeed to the throne, but a different one of David's sons from a different mother wants to seize the throne instead. He tries, and Solomon ends up executing him for treason. And so, yes, David had a positive relationship with Abigail. That does not mean that David's polygamy is presented in a positive light in the Bible. In fact, it's associated with quite catastrophic consequences. Now, the most sympathetic category of polygamy in the Old Testament is polygamy out of desperation. So Isaiah chapter 4 is describing a future where so many Israelite men have died in battle that women vastly outnumber men. And it says, in that day, 7 women will take hold of one man and say, we will eat our own food and provide our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. So in a deeply patriarchal society, there was immense stigma attached to being a widow or being an unmarried woman. And in general, women also in patriarchal societies needed husbands for food, shelter, protection, all these things. These women are like, hey, we're even going to bring our own food and our own clothes. Please just let us actually be married. Now, obviously, this is not ideal. And this is being presented by Isaiah as a warning to the people of this is what's going to happen if you are not living the way that you should. You're going to end up in a bad situation like this. It's not positive. Levirate marriage is another example of polygamy out of a kind of desperation. So this is a situation in the Old Testament where if a man dies without having had a son, then his widow is supposed to marry a living brother of his, who then is supposed to father a child, a son, on behalf of the dead man to keep the dead man's name and lineage going. But there's no exception if the living brother already has a wife. And so most scholars believe that this would have been a requirement even if the living brother already had a wife, and in this sense, polygamy would have been codified into the Old Testament law, but it's also definitely not an ideal situation, and this is not something that Christians have ever embraced or practiced. So we know, though, that by the time of the New Testament, by the time of Jesus and Paul, their view of marriage is only as monogamous. So how did we get there? How do we get from a point where the Old Testament permits polygamy, even if it views it as non-ideal, to no room for polygamy in the New Testament? Well, the first hints of this shift that took place show up in the prophets in the Old Testament, because they begin for the first time to use marriage as a metaphor for God's covenantal love for Israel. Hosea says, in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. Jeremiah 3 says, but like a woman unfaithful to her husband, so you, Israel, have been unfaithful to me. The reason why this is significant for our understanding of marriage is because the Old Testament is clear that God's covenant with Israel is an exclusive covenant. God chooses Israel as his one chosen people, and they are to honor him as their one God and worship him as their only God. And so if marriage then is supposed to reflect a covenant that is an exclusive covenant, what this is indicating is that marriage really should also be an exclusive partnership to be faithfully mirroring that covenant relationship. So in the prophets, adultery and idolatry are connected, and by implication, so are monogamy and monotheism. Now, this is also a very interesting historical point here. The next evidence of a shift among ancient Jews away from polygamy comes in the 3rd century BC when they were translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, this famous translation that's called the Septuagint. So if you open your Bibles to Genesis 2:24, you will read the Hebrew version. I mean, in English, but it's the Hebrew text. And it says, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." However, what the Septuagint says, and also what the New Testament says every time it quotes this verse, because they were using the Septuagint version, including Jesus himself, it says, "The two will become one flesh." It changed the word "they" to "the two." As the biblical scholar David Instone Brewer writes, this gloss was a very common addition to the text. This wasn't just the Greek translation. This was all ancient translations of the Hebrew text added the word "two." Instone Brewer writes, "It reaffirmed that a marriage is made between only two individuals, and thus polygamy is an aberration." Now, that's still a strong suggestive hint. It's not an outright explicit opposition. The first evidence that we have of explicit Jewish opposition to polygamy comes between the 2nd and the 1st centuries BC. This was a fascinating find from the Dead Sea Scrolls in a document called the Damascus Document. It's from a Jewish community at Qumran, which is a small town near the Dead Sea. And they explicitly opposed polygamy and believed it was sinful. And they write, "They are caught by two snares, by sexual sin, namely taking two wives in their lives, while the foundation of creation is male and female, he created them. And those who entered Noah's ark went in 2 by 2 into the ark." So they're comparing and quoting these two verses, Genesis 1:27, male and female, he created them, and Genesis 7:9, which says male and female came to Noah and entered the ark. They're kind of adding their gloss on that it's 2 by 2. We know that it's a male and his mate. That's what it says. And so what the Damascus document is doing is connecting these two and increasingly arguing, as some Jews who opposed polygamy began to do by the 1st century BC, they were using Genesis 1:27 as a proof text in favor of monogamy. The male and female is supposed to be the emphasis on the two. Well, this is particularly interesting because there's one very famous Jew who did this exact thing, and his name is Jesus of Nazareth. So in Matthew 19, Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" And he says, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate.'" And you can see the parallels, the remarkable parallels between the Damascus document and the teaching of Jesus even more clearly in Mark's version of this teaching. The Damascus document says, while the foundation of creation is male and female, and Mark says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And then, what the Damascus document emphasizes 2 by 2, not only does Jesus quote the Greek version of Genesis 2:24 that includes the two shall become one flesh, he then emphasizes the two by repeating it in the next sentence. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Now, we don't know if Jesus himself had read the Damascus document in particular, but clearly this perspective was in the air among some Jews in his day, and he agreed with it. This is also so fascinating because in the contemporary debate about same-sex marriage, many non-affirming Christians will point to this exact text and say, aha, Jesus quoted male and female from Genesis 1:27. He didn't need to. The reason he must have done that was to say marriage must be heterosexual. He must have been emphasizing that sex difference is necessary for marriage. But that doesn't make sense historically because no one was questioning whether same-sex marriage was even a possibility in the ancient world. It was not on the ancient radar at all. The entire issue of sex difference was simply taken for granted by everyone. There would have been no point in Jesus going out of his way to emphasize this. What was not taken for granted by everyone was monogamy over polygamy. And so in its historical context and throughout the centuries, this is how Christian interpreters have read why Jesus quoted male and female. Jerome said, he said male and female because he didn't say male and females, plural. John Calvin said he quoted this because he insists on the number 2. John Wesley said by saying this, he condemned polygamy. Beyond the teachings of Jesus, the New Testament in 1 Timothy does explicitly prohibit polygamy for church leaders. It says, therefore, an overseer or bishop must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled. The Greek here literally means a one-woman man. Some Christians interpret this to mean that this prohibits remarriage after divorce. In the early church, some even interpret it to mean that it prohibited remarriage after the death of one spouse, that you could not have 2 wives at all in your lifetime, even if one of them had died. But what it at a minimum definitely means is you cannot have two wives at the same time. There are other texts in the New Testament that also talk about marriage in a way that requires monogamy for the principles that they outline to work. 1 Corinthians 7 famously says that both husbands and wives share mutual authority over one another's bodies. This was a very egalitarian and countercultural teaching in the first century that did not see women overall as equal to men or deserving of equal authority over men. But in order to have equal authority over your spouse's body, you can't be sharing that authority with multiple other spouses. If you've got three people having the same authority, it really doesn't work the same way. Likewise, Ephesians 5 compares the relationship of marriage to the relationship of Christ and the church. And in describing this, and also quotes the 2 version from Genesis 2:24, it says, "Just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." The vision of marriage in Ephesians 5 is one of complete self-giving between the spouses. Well, in order to completely give of yourself, you cannot do that to multiple spouses at the same time. It would inherently divide the self-gift. So these principles in the New Testament, in addition to the teaching of Jesus himself and the statement in 1 Timothy 3, really only can work in the context of monogamous marriage. So the sexual ethic of the New Testament, and therefore the Christian sexual ethic, which restricted sex to monogamous marriage for both women and men, was completely new in world history. As we know, it differed from the Jewish ethic in that it did not permit polygamy, but it also differed quite significantly from the prevailing sexual ethics of the Greco-Roman world. Ancient Greece and Rome actually did not allow polygamy. They were the first civilizations that we know of that required marital monogamy. You could only marry one person. The key difference, though, was that husbands could still sleep around with whoever they wanted to. Women had to be faithful, monogamously faithful to their husbands, and husbands could do basically whatever they wanted. Greco-Roman men could sleep with anyone who was not the legal property of another adult male citizen. That even included their own slaves, who they could treat as sexual objects without any fear of social backlash or disapproval. So Christianity then came along and just eliminated this massive double standard between men and women when it came to sexual ethics. And this was particularly good news if you were a woman in the first century, or if you were enslaved. Because now, for the first time, if your husband became a Christian, you had an external authority telling him that he needed to be faithful to you. And if you were enslaved, you now had an external authority telling the head of the household that he could not rape or abuse you. So, although the Christian sexual ethic seems very conservative to many people today, and in some respects it certainly is, it does put many constraints around sexual behavior, in its historical context, the Christian sexual revolution of the early centuries AD was a profoundly progressive social reform in its impacts on women and other social groups that weren't elite male citizens. But since the second sexual revolution of the 1960s, a common critique has been that this Christian emphasis on monogamy has been far too stuffy and conservative, and that although Christianity may deserve a little bit of credit for eliminating the double standard between men and women, what it really should have done was eliminated it in the other direction. That instead of restricting men to sex within monogamous marriage, so boring, some say, what it should have done was liberated everyone, women included, to have sex outside of monogamous marriage. So, as adherents of sex positivity see it, we can finally correct this error today by normalizing non-monogamy in order to truly achieve liberation and flourishing for everyone. Well, to assess that claim, we really need to look at this in two parts. First, we need to assess Christianity's requirement of marital monogamy, which it inherited in a sense from Greco-Roman civilization. But then we also need to assess how Christianity built on that foundation through its unique requirement of sexual monogamy in marriage, which is the issue that is under the strongest critique today. So, in accordance with the principle of Chesterton's fence, I want us to consider what social purpose and value both of those forms of monogamy may have had historically and even still today. First is the issue of marital monogamy versus polygamy. For anyone growing up in the West, we just take it for granted that you can only marry one person. Most of us don't even think about that as much of a limitation. That's just the way it is. But this is not the way it has been for the vast majority of societies. In fact, 85% of societies throughout history on the anthropological record have allowed polygamy. And in almost every case, it has been polygyny, a man with multiple wives. Only 0.3% of societies have practiced polyandry, and it wasn't fun. It wasn't a status thing like it was for men. When polyandry was practiced, typically in Tibet, Nepal, and central China, if you want to look it up, it was a situation out of poverty, where you would have a family that was very poor, and they did not want to divide the land between two brothers, so they'd have the two brothers marry the same woman, so they didn't have to divide the land. This is not even something most of these women were particularly excited about, and polyandry was always practiced alongside polygyny. So some people have wondered, well, why is polyandry so rare? Maybe it's just because women have been historically subjugated, as they certainly have. And maybe now that we have much greater equality for men and women, maybe if we were to re-legalize polygamy today, we'd see just as much polyandry as polygyny. Well, I don't think that that is true. And the reason is because there are basic biological differences between the sexes, especially as it relates to reproductive roles, that overwhelmingly make having multiple husbands far less appealing to most women than having multiple wives is to most men. These are the basic differences. A woman, no matter how many husbands she marries, cannot increase the number of children she has. She is limited to about 1 pregnancy per year until menopause. Also, pregnancy and nursing are incredibly physically demanding tasks that she cannot delegate to a husband. She can have 20 husbands and none of them can do those things for her. Also, the reality is, when you have multiple men in a relationship with a woman at the same time, there will be confusion frequently about paternity. And this is not a good thing, but it is an unfortunate reality that most men are not willing to stick around and invest in raising the child if they're not sure if the child is theirs. So all of these reasons combine, and this is why the Harvard anthropologist Joseph Henrich has said that for women, extra husbands are rarely worth the trouble. All right, we have some people clapping, that's right. We do love our one husbands though, right? Okay. But polygyny is completely reversed. Polygyny actually is extremely appealing to a certain subset of men. High-status men is what anthropologists call them. I know it sounds like a loaded term, but it's meant in a neutral way, because polygamy for men can be an incredibly powerful self-reinforcing engine of wealth, status, and power. This is how it works. The more wives that a man has, the more children he can have. There's almost no practical limit on how many more children a man could have, depending on how many women he is able to marry. The more children he has, so the more sons that he has, he gets more labor from them, he gets more physical security from them, and he gets more political alliances from them as they grow up and form male kinship networks. When he has daughters, he gets money from the daughters, because in polygamous societies, women are treated as objects for purchase. They are seen as very rare and valuable commodities because they're increasingly difficult to come by as more of the men keep gobbling them up. And so you can charge what is called a bride price. In monogamous societies, there's such a thing as a dowry, right? But it works the opposite way in polygamous societies. It's a bride price. You have to pay me for my daughter, and you have to pay me a lot of money. Also, you try to marry off your daughter to a powerful family. So you're building further political alliances by doing that. So all this together leads a polygamous patriarch to have growing wealth, status, and power that allows him then to keep buying more wives and repeat and repeat. This is why in polygamous societies, it is not uncommon for the highest status man in the society, typically the ruler, to have thousands of wives. Because there's really no limit to this logic. It functions almost like a monopoly. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that actually in polygamous societies, polygamy does appeal to some women who are somewhat unfortunately by anthropologists termed low-status women. This really just means poor women. Now, all else being equal, there are not very many women who want to share a husband. But in polygamous societies, all else is not equal. These are deeply unequal societies because of these dynamics. Consequently, many poor women would prefer to have the financial security of a wealthy, politically powerful man, and also to have their children then be in a politically powerful family, than to marry a poor single man who cannot provide those benefits. The question this raises then is, if polygamy is this appealing to the men who run the world, and it is, how did we ever get to a point where these men decided to willingly give this up, to give up this engine of power and wealth and status? This is the question that has been called the puzzle of monogamous marriage by anthropologists. How did this ever happen in the first place? Joseph Henrich, in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, has explained that the reason why first ancient Greece and Rome and later Christian civilizations decided to limit marriage to one person, there's a practical reason for it. Because even though it comes at the cost of elite men personally, it has dramatic benefits for the society overall. So these benefits stem from what anthropologists call polygamy's math problem. And this is a chart from Henrich's book that shows you how this math problem works. In a fully monogamous society, here you've got 20 men and 20 women. Each man has a wife. And we're just going to assume for the purposes here that everybody's heterosexual. We know it's not true, but most people are. And so just for illustrative purposes here, we're going to see. But in a society with even moderate polygyny, if only 20% of men are practicing polygyny, 40% of men are likely to have no wives at all. Why? Because the top man has 4 wives, the next one has 3, the next one has 2. And this is moderate levels of polygyny. It's often much more extreme than this in real life. And why is this a problem? Well, obviously, if you're in that 40% of, quote, low-status men, you're not happy about this, but why should anyone else care? Why should the elite men care, right, if they get what they want? It's because unmarried men are particularly prone to crime. They are much more likely to commit robbery, murder, and rape. And as Henrich has written, getting married cuts a man's chances of committing a crime by half. This is not just a selection effect where the more responsible men end up getting married. This is independent of that. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because once a man is married, and especially once he has children, he has a lot more to lose. He is living for something and for someone. And so the potential benefits of breaking in and stealing somebody's money, it's not nearly as attractive anymore when you have so much to lose. And in a monogamous society, you don't have nearly as much to gain because you already hit your cap. You have your one spouse, you're done. In a polygamous society, however, getting married and having children does not have the same domesticating effect on men that it does in monogamous societies because you can always keep gaining more. And so it does not redirect that male energy away from the constant pursuit of more wives. This is why normative monogamy, as Henrich has detailed with excellent research, reduces crime rates, including rape and kidnapping. Tragically, many women are kidnapped in polygamous societies by the low-status men who think they'll never be able to find a wife, and so they kidnap women. It's horrific. Murder, assault, and robbery go down. Sex slavery and prostitution decline. The spousal age gap and gender inequality decline. Why is this? Because in a polygamous society where there's this significant imbalance of who is available in terms of men or women, men who want more wives keep having to go further and further down on the age spectrum to find the next available women until the point where you're talking about young girls. This creates child marriage. Child marriage is endemic in polygamous societies for this reason. And child marriage is a horror on its own, but it also has many knock-on effects because if a 13-year-old girl marries a 40-year-old man, they don't have a real relationship. There is no reciprocity, there is no mutuality, there is no mutual respect between them. And so the inequality is just further baked in. It also, normative monogamy in a society, when it is mandated in society, it reduces rates of child neglect, abuse, accidental death, and homicide. Why is this? It's for the reasons that we saw in the Bible. Because when you have other kids from other mothers who you really don't actually want to get priority, you don't want them to get the inheritance, you don't want them being the favored child, you are much less likely to invest in their well-being. And yes, sometimes more likely to even engage in homicide. Moreover, normative monogamy doesn't just reduce these bad things, it also increases savings, child investment, and economic productivity. Why is this? Because in a monogamous society, a man, once he is married and has children, redirects a lot of his extra energy instead of trying to find more wives and have more kids and have that whole self-reinforcing monopoly cycle. Instead, he invests his energy toward his relationship with his spouse, toward his relationship with his children, and toward starting businesses and engaging in commerce that benefits the entire society. This is why monogamous societies are more economically prosperous than polygamous societies. The Brown Professor of Political Science, Rose McDermott, has done groundbreaking and painstaking work looking at the effects of polygyny specifically on women, men, children, and society. And she has described the harms of polygamy as essentially operating as a hidden hand. The problem with polygamy is not that it is impossible for one man to treat multiple wives well. Of course, it is possible. The problem is with the fundamental dynamics that end up being magnified across a society as this practice is normalized and begins to scale to any degree, even 10% of the society practicing this. So McDermott has shown that polygyny increases rates of child marriage for the reason we discussed. It also, because of that, increases rates of maternal mortality. Because the younger the younger a woman is, when a 13-year-old girl gives birth, she is much more likely to have serious complications from that can be fatal. It also increases rates of domestic violence. Why is that? Unfortunately, when men don't respect their wives, they are more likely to abuse them. And men don't respect their wives when they don't ever have a meaningful mutual relationship in the first place because she was 13 and he was 40. Also, this is a particularly tragic consequence. Polygyny increases rates of female genital mutilation. Why is this? It's because in polygamous societies, especially poor families, their daughters are the economic equivalent of someone's home. That is what they have put all their eggs in the basket of, is the bride price they will one day be able to get for selling their daughter, but they can only get the bride price if she is a virgin when they sell her. And how do you make sure that she stays a virgin? I'm sorry, this shouldn't be this upsetting. It is very upsetting, though. You mutilate her so that she cannot experience sexual pleasure, so that she will be less inclined to have sex before marriage. It's horrifying, but this is what happens in polygamous societies. Polygamy also decreases overall life expectancy. Sorry, I didn't expect to. I've talked about this, I just didn't expect to be, okay. Children are actually 24% more likely to die in polygamous versus monogamous families for some of the reasons I was discussing. And as McDermott has concluded, in short, polygyny costs a lot of women and children their lives. And it doesn't just hurt women. It hurts men and boys too. Obviously, no one wants to lose out on being able to have a mate. But the way that some polygamous societies deal with the instability of many unmarried young men and with their testosterone-fueled volatility that can contribute to crime is they just expel all of these men from their community before they even have a chance to grow up. This even happens in the United States of America. So the fundamentalist Mormons broke off from the mainstream Mormon church once it prohibited polygamy, and there are still tens of thousands of fundamentalist Mormons in the United States. And there have been waves of these stories, even 20 years ago, of what are called lost boys. Boys as young as 13 years old who are dumped on the side of the road in Arizona and Utah in our country by the leaders of the fundamentalist Mormons and told they will never see their families again or go to heaven. These boys in these stories, this boy who wrote this book, they would write Mother's Day cards to their mothers and they never get a response. This is a horrific kind of child abuse. But this is what happens through the self-serving logic of polygamy, because the men at the top want more wives and they are willing to do anything for their own self-interest, including destroy the lives of the excess men who would be causing problems in their community because they took the mates that these men could have had. The leader of this community had 80 wives, 20 of whom were underage, and fortunately he is now serving a life sentence in prison. This is why it is so important that we retain a criminal prohibition of polygamy, because of this. But polygamy doesn't just harm the societies that practice it. The harms and the instability of polygamy radiate out and destabilize countries and societies that don't even practice it. Why does this happen? The political scientists Valerie Hudson and Andrea Denboer have shown quite carefully that when there is this sex ratio imbalance that is created by the practice of polygamy, one way that societies can deal with that, kind of similar to the Lost Boys, is they send these men off to war. And it's all the better for the cruel, callous leaders of these countries if these men die in war, because it fixes the sex ratio imbalance. This is why countries that practice polygamy are more prone to war, conquest, colonization, and authoritarianism. Because what is the most powerful tool of an authoritarian? It is to be able to say, I am the only thing that stands in between you and chaos. And polygamy creates chaos. It also, you kind of need the heavy hand to be able to force men off to war. The other thing that polygamy empowers, not just authoritarians and tyrants, it also empowers gangs and terrorist groups, because these young unmarried men feel they have nothing to live for. They feel hopeless. They will never actually be able to have a wife, be able to have a family. They're called bare branches by these political scientists, and they are ripe recruits for gangs and terrorist groups, even terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. McDermott has also shown that polygyny relatedly leads to increased weapons spending in countries that practice it, and it leads to decreased civil liberties and political rights. All of this is why Valerie Hudson has said there's a veritable law of social science that you cannot build a democracy on top of polygyny. It can't be done. Many political scientists and anthropologists agree that normative monogamy is a necessary precondition for both democracy and gender equality. And that's because monogamy, normative monogamy, requiring it at a society-wide level is a deeply egalitarian social reform for the purpose of fairness throughout the society. This does not mean that monogamy itself guarantees democracy and gender equality, just that you cannot achieve them without it. That is why there are no polygamous societies that are democracies. There never have been, and there never will be. This is why in 2011, the Supreme Court of British Columbia upheld Canada's criminal prohibition on polygamy. They concluded that it was harmful to women, to children, to society, and to the institution of marriage. All that to say, I hope I persuaded you that patriarchal polygamy in particular is not good. But what does this mean for the distinct question of the contemporary question of polyamory and non-monogamy? Because in many ways, polyamory is seeking to be almost as opposite of polygamy as possible, of patriarchal polygamy as possible. The vast majority of advocates for polyamory non-monogamy are extremely progressive in their politics and worldview and abhor patriarchy. And so, I mean, obviously there is a connection point just in that they're talking about more than two. That's the similarity. But other than that, ideologically, they almost seem like complete opposites. And so, is it possible then for society to move beyond normative monogamy today, but in a way that's actually progressive rather than regressive for society at large? Or do polyamory and non-monogamy, even in their best possible forms, like polygamy, still have a hidden hand of unintended negative consequences? I would argue that they do. I think there are three fundamental unintended negative consequences that develop from even the best possible, most progressively intended forms of polyamory and non-monogamy. The first is polyamory's math problem. This is similar to, but distinct from polygamy's math problem. The problem here is not that you have 40% of the men at the bottom with no mate. The problem here is if you're trying to imagine what is the best possible polyamorous setup that could most closely approximate Christian values, then you would say it is going to be a closed triad between three partners, right? They're all exclusive between one another, or four, or something like that. The issue, though, is that a monogamous relationship is just one relationship, but each person you add, the number of relationships adds by more than the partner you just added. A throuple is three relationships. Each person is in a relationship with each other. A quad of four people polycule is 6. 5 people, 10 relationships. And it's just a statistical reality that the more partners that are added to a union, there are now more points of failure created within that union. Each additional partner makes the relationship structure less stable. And in fact, many polyamorous authors and even advocates themselves do acknowledge this about closed triads and polycules. Kathy Labriola has written the Polyamory Breakup book, and she's a supporter of polyamory, but she said that a closed throuple is the polyamorous structure most likely to cause a, quote, cavalcade of disaster in what she calls high-stakes polydominoes. She says, either one duo in the triad falls apart, taking the other two relationships and the whole triad down with it, or one duo is much stronger than the other two relationships, and that couple splits off and abandons the third partner completely. It can be really epically disastrous, she says, and this, again, is a supporter of non-monogamy. She just doesn't think this configuration is a good idea, generally. But you may say, okay, so it is harder to make that sort of relationship structure work. But if 3 people want to take that risk and give it a go, and that's their preference, why not? Well, the problem is that we all exist in communities, and our relationship choices and structures have an effect on the communities that we are a part of. We all know that it is difficult for friend groups to stay fully intact when 2 people in the friend group date and then break up. Even if it's a fairly amicable breakup, most people need space and time after that. And if it's not an amicable breakup, the consequences for the friend group can be a pretty painful fracture across the friend group, not just the 2 people involved. And so it's just a reality that the more people that you date, the more people you will break up with over time. And it is not wise for a community, especially a community like a church, to embrace relationship structures or practices that will significantly increase the number of breakups within that community over time, because it is inherently destabilizing to the community or the church community. I mean, just imagine that you're going to a church where the lead singer of worship is dating the drummer, but is also dating one of the greeters. And that greeter is also dating one of the Sunday school teachers, who's also dating one of the deacons, and on and on. Well, it doesn't take very many breakups to create that high-stakes poly-dominoes scenario that Kathy Labriola described. Another key issue that the acceptance of non-monogamy or polyamory creates, apart from this destabilization of community, which is quite significant on its own, is that it also changes a fundamental norm about relationships for every person in the community. Monogamy is a norm that applies to all relationships. So if it is demoted from a requirement to a preference for any couple in the community, then whether it was the intention or not, it has effectively been demoted to the status of a preference for every couple in the community. It does not just affect the 3 individuals in one throuple. Now, of course, not every couple in a community, and perhaps not even most, would necessarily take advantage of this norm changing. But the fact that the norm has changed at all means 2 things. 1, it means that a wedding ring on someone's finger, the sign of being married, no longer necessarily means that person is supposed to be off limits as a romantic or even possibly sexual partner. So if you are a single person visiting a church for the first time, and this church has a standard for everyone of monogamy, and a married couple invites you to their home for dinner, you don't think twice about what their intentions are. They're just being hospitable. But if you're a single person and you go to a church for the first time that does not have a norm for everyone of monogamy, and a married couple invites you to their home for dinner, you have to ask other questions. You have to also wonder, wait, is this just hospitality, or are they interested in me? Do they see me as a potential romantic or sexual partner? And we know the nature of humans in general. This is not about any particular people. This is just people in general are prone to selfishness sometimes, and that means this can easily veer toward increasing objectification of people within the church community. You are then more likely, once the possibility exists, people are more likely to start viewing more and more people, not just as a person made in the image of God, it's also, you're kind of attractive. Maybe we could make something happen with a lot of different people. This alters the dynamic for every interaction among adults in the community who could even possibly be attracted to each other. And you may think, well, no, everyone who wants to remain monogamous can just be really clear that they're monogamous. This is our preference. Tell everybody. And so that those who want to pursue non-monogamy will just know that they are off limits and they will respect those relationship boundaries. But preferences, as opposed to requirements, are provisional and subject to change. And in a community that has removed the universal norm of monogamy, a monogamous couple is only monogamous as long as they choose to be and prefer to be, and they could always change their minds. And that is the second thing, that changing the norm of monogamy also changes at the community level. Downgrading this norm of monogamy to the status of a preference shifts this burden, and it imposes a burden on every couple and really every individual, both single and in a relationship, to determine, communicate, and enforce their desired relationship boundaries. Many married couples are friends with and hang out with other married couples. Now, in a monogamous community, although it's of course always possible that somebody could be attracted to somebody else's spouse, that's not even a thought you entertain. That's just something you shut down before you even think about it. And if you ever think about it, you certainly would never say it, and then you would tell yourself to stop thinking about it. Because it isn't a possibility, and it shouldn't be a possibility. But in a community that accepts non-monogamy for anyone, it is now always a possibility for everyone. And you may have told everyone that you and Joe are committed to monogamy. But eventually, your friends Sarah and Mike say, after a game night, hey, look, like, no pressure at all. We totally respect where you guys are at. We know you're in a different place. Just wanted to let you know, like, if anything ever changed in the future, we would definitely be interested. Again, though, like, no pressure. We're totally happy to just stay friends, right? Shoot your shot, right? Why not? Well, according to the norms of a community that accepts non-monogamy, Sarah and Mike didn't do anything wrong. They didn't violate any norms of the community. And in a monogamous community, there wouldn't be anything wrong about a single person saying the same thing to another single person. But just because there's not anything wrong with a single person saying that to another single person, we all know it's still dangerous, okay? That's something people often really think about, because if the answer is no, that's awkward. It's just awkward. Just asking the question changes the dynamic of a relationship, and it can make continued close friendships much harder and sometimes not possible. We all know this from our own life experience, even within the world of monogamy. This is just the reality. If a friend is interested in you and you're not interested in them, it's awkward. And so the norm of monogamy in this sense serves as a key guardrail against, first, a lot of awkward and uncomfortable situations, but even more seriously, against objectification and manipulation, even unintentional manipulation. So Kathy Labriola, again, has described, she says, a lot of times in these triads and quads, one person is feeling coerced whether they say it or not. There's a lot of pressure on that person because the two other people want this. Usually, if they're two couples getting together, there's at least one person, and usually two, that do not want this, but they do not feel able to say it. They feel like, I don't want to be a poor sport and be the one that ruins the party. Now, some people say the way to deal with this is just by having better communication. Just have open and honest communication and always tell people, please be willing to tell me if you have any anxieties and concerns. And better communication is great, but you know what's better is maintaining the norm of monogamy because it does all of that work for you. So these are some of the consequences of blessing non-monogamy at the level of a community. And they help to illustrate a fundamental difference between non-monogamy and same-sex marriage, and that is this. Blessing same-sex marriage does not change the meaning of marriage for the rest of the community in a way that has a direct impact on people. If you are already married and then your church decides to allow same-sex marriage, it does not affect your marriage at all. The only thing it affects is that now if you're not married, you have the option to marry someone of the same sex if you want, but most people won't want to because most people aren't attracted to the same sex. Blessing non-monogamy, however, changes the meaning of marriage for every couple in the community, whether they want it or not. And that is why sometimes people assume, oh, non-monogamy, it's just same-sex marriage 2.0. It's just that next step in removing that next barrier, changing that next taboo. They're actually moving in fundamentally different directions. They are completely different in terms of their impacts on the community. So those are the first two hidden hand problems of non-monogamy: the math problem and the community problem. But finally, and arguably most significantly, polyamory also has a gender problem. Some assume that because we have so much more gender equality in society today than in the past, and because most of today's polyamory advocates are so progressive, that men and women would equally take advantage of non-monogamy if it is normalized for everyone. But all of the available evidence suggests that this is not the case, and that on average, men will be much more interested in non-monogamy than women. The secular feminist author Louise Perry wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, in which she argued that a culture of casual sex benefits a small number of men at the expense of most women. The reason, she said, is that the research is clear. We know that men, on average, prefer to have more sex and with a larger number of partners, and that the vast majority of women, if given the option, prefer a committed relationship to casual sex. And the surveys consistently bear this out. Men are nearly 3 times more likely than women to desire polyamory. They are over twice as likely to have already engaged in it. Among heterosexual women who opened a sexual relationship with a man, 40% said the man wanted it more. Only 38% said it was equally desired. In a recent survey, a full third of British men said they were open to polygyny, to actually having multiple wives. Only 5% of women thought that was something they wanted to do. But when it came to polyandry, there was no sex difference. About 10% of both men and women said they would be interested in that. So what might that mean over time? Currently, polyamory is a very progressive coded topic. There aren't very many polyamorous Republicans. And the vast majority of authors and activists who advocate for non-monogamy are opposed to patriarchy and support gender equality. That's why the current face of polyamory looks like this. It looks quite progressive. And in fact, several cities in the United States, in California and Massachusetts, have even begun to offer domestic partnership recognition to polyamorous relationships in recent years. And so far, the main people registering their plural relationships with those cities have been distinctly left-leaning. However, if this becomes more common, or if states or the country as a whole begins to legally recognize and extend various rights and privileges to relationships of 3 or more people, that is a right that would be available to anyone. You cannot put ideological litmus tests on a right to plural marriage or relationship recognition and say only card-carrying ultra-progressives may apply. No, also, very conservative men with deeply patriarchal attitudes who want 2, 3, 4, or more wives may equally apply. And that is why the potential reemergence of patriarchal polygamy is always crouching at the door in these conversations. The desire for patriarchal polygamy is not a historical relic as much as we might wish that it were. And if it were permitted again, there is ample evidence that it would return with a vengeance. Some of the clearest evidence of this comes from Andrew Tate, who is an unfortunately extremely popular, extremely misogynistic male influencer in the manosphere, who has recently been making the case against monogamy and for polygamy. And this is what he says: monogamy is not natural for men. Real men expletive and make babies with as many women as possible. They then raise the babies in one big group with compliant women who understand the man's genetic legacy is worth more than her jealousy. Nice guy, right? The forcing of a monogamous society mitigates the true distribution curves of mating pairs. It's about control to prevent the strongest of men having larger continuances of their bloodlines. They fear men like me having 9 baby machines and 40 children. So they try and tell you it's wrong. Truthfully, there's nothing more right. Well, there's a lot of rank misogyny in here, but if we can analyze this apart from that, some of what he's saying apart from the rank misogyny is true. Monogamy is not natural for men. It is also true that monogamous societies have to be forced. It has to be imposed from the top down, and it is exactly for the reason of preventing men like Andrew Tate from having 9 what we would call wives and 40 children, for the precise reason that he calls them baby machines, for the precise reason that this leads to the degradation and the subordination of women when it is allowed. The reason that we tell you it's wrong is not because it's secretly right. It's because allowing selfish men like Andrew Tate to do this is deeply damaging both to the women and the children in their lives and to their societies as a whole. And in this sense, the imposition of monogamy functions as a kind of antitrust action to break up the monopolies of these elite men who want to form massive harems of women. Socially imposed monogamy is what made gender equality possible. But we should not assume that just because greater equality has been achieved, that it cannot be undone. If the conditions that made women's equality possible in the first place begin to erode, then so will women's equality itself. So that, I would argue, is what the 3 fundamental problems with polyamory are. Its hidden hand of unintended negative consequences as it scales up over time. Its math problem, its community problem, and its gender problem. But, and this is the last point I'll make, some do ask, wait, okay, well, the gender problem, that's really just a heterosexual thing, right? So if you're gay, we can do it, right? And it's true that on average, gay men do engage in higher rates of non-monogamy than other demographics. And some, like Dan Savage, have critiqued normative monogamy, said, oh, that's just too heteronormative. And he's argued that having a monogamish open relationship style approach can actually aid the long-term relationship stability of gay men's relationships. Now, I have met Dan before, and I like Dan, so this is nothing personal. But I do disagree quite strongly with Dan's view here. I think what he's saying has a kernel of truth to it. There are examples of gay male couples who end up staying together longer than they otherwise would have because they mutually agree to have sex with other people outside the relationship, but just sex, not emotional commitment outside of the relationship. So yes, there are some couples who stay together longer because of that. The problem is that that also has an impact beyond the couple. It has an impact on the broader gay male community and subculture. And this is a community and subculture that is not perfect, and where these dynamics of greater incidence of non-monogamy have a harmful effect on other gay men who aren't even in their original relationship. So there's a famous book called The Velvet Rage, which I imagine many of you have read, Overcoming the Pain of Growing Up Gay in a Straight Man's World, by a gay man and psychologist named Alan Downs. And he starts the book by saying, we have more sexual partners in a lifetime than any other grouping of people. And at the same time, we also have among the highest rates of depression and suicide, not to mention sexually transmitted diseases. It's safe to estimate that virtually every gay man has wondered on more than a few occasions if it is truly possible to be consistently happy and a gay man. Now, this was 20 years ago. I think it is more possible today to be consistently happy and a gay man. But these dynamics are very real and very challenging. The gay author Matthew Todd has written, "The way we sexualize our culture so heavily, and the way many of us have sex so casually, leads to us treating each other as objects. The person inside, their thoughts, feelings, emotions, is less important. That's okay if it's all you want. But most of us say that's not all we want. And in fact, I know so many gay men who lament at the over-sexualization of gay male subculture because without structures in place to support relationships, it can naturally gravitate toward a culture of casual sex, partying, and drugs." And so some people say, well, hey, you know what? If that's what gay men want, then what's the problem? Maybe they're just different. Maybe we're just different, some people say. And so we just don't want monogamy and that should be accepted. But that's not really true. In fact, large majorities of gay men in surveys say that they do want a monogamous relationship. What is true is that there is so often a tension between our short-term desires and our long-term goals. Not just for gay men, for everyone. Everyone has to choose to restrain many of our short-term desires whenever they're going to get in the way of our long-term goals. But we also need help in doing that. We can lament a hypersexualized culture and wish for something better, but realistically, it is extremely difficult for individuals to swim against the current. Broader culture shifts require broader support structures and networks, and gay men need those structures just as much as everyone else. In fact, as the Irish legal professor and gay man Ronan McRae has written in an important new book, the damage to the self-esteem of gay men wrought by the discrimination of the past and the present probably means that gay men have a greater need than others for some kind of structure to help them to channel their sexual desires in fruitful directions. Marriage is one of those structures. But beyond that, what is the institution in society that does more than any other to support marriages? It is the church. And this is where the affirming church has a critical role to play today. The non-affirming church, unfortunately, has essentially abdicated any support role for gay men and lesbians by saying that no relationship we ever have will ever be accepted or supported, no matter how committed or faithful. So it's not surprising, and I certainly have no sense of judgment, that many throw up their hands and try to start from scratch, often in ways that depart from the norm of monogamy. Because lifelong monogamous commitment requires community support. But when affirming churches embrace same-sex marriage, but also eventually relax the standard of monogamy in marriage, they are actually contributing to this very same problem, just from the opposite direction. The unique opportunity that an Orthodox and affirming church has is not only to bless same-sex marriages at their outset, but to consistently support them throughout the couple's lives by maintaining a strong commitment to uphold the standard of monogamy and fidelity in marriage. Now, I know that some affirming churches and pastors can feel squeamish about this because it is absolutely true that gay people have faced an enormous amount of rejection, ostracism, and shame in the church just for being gay. And so if a same-sex couple is welcomed into a church and the church later realizes that couple is not monogamous, there can be a temptation. People think, oh no, we just had the we welcome all sign. And the last thing we want to do is heap any shame on these people. I'm sure they've been through so much, and we do have so much compassion and sympathy, as we should, for why people are in a different place or have a different perspective. So there could be a temptation to look the other way, or even to just say, you know what, we're just going to say it's A-okay. We're going to endorse non-monogamy because we just love everybody, so that the couple won't feel any additional burden of shame or alienation from the church. And the heart of that is a noble goal, right? Our goal should never be to shame anyone. But that is not what maintaining the norm of monogamy is about. It is not about finger-wagging. It is not about self-righteousness, and it is not about judgmentalism. It is about helping people channel their desires toward their long-term fulfillment. It is about helping people sanctify their desires in accordance with our calling as followers of Jesus. And it's about helping people live in a way that builds up and benefits the entire community, the broader body of Christ of which they are a member. And of course, as I've covered in some detail in this talk, which is now coming to its close, the norm of monogamy matters for far more than just gay people. So to end, well, I will say this first. I think when you back out and study this, Jesus' teaching on two in marriage is probably one of the most historically consequential teachings of the entire New Testament. Because normative monogamy is why we live in a democracy today. Normative monogamy is why women have the right to vote. Normative monogamy is why there was a women's rights movement, and without a women's rights movement, there could never be a gay rights movement. A society that believes that men must subordinate women will never be able to accept same-sex relationships. Gay marriage is predicated on normative monogamy. We would not have it without it, and eroding that norm will imperil it. So, why does monogamy matter? It matters for relationship stability. It matters for community stability. It matters for reducing objectification and manipulation. It matters for the equality of women. It matters for gay rights and gay marriage. It matters for economic prosperity. It matters for civil liberties. It matters for reducing domestic violence. It matters for ending female genital mutilation. It matters for increasing life expectancy. It matters for child welfare. It matters for reducing crime. It matters for undermining gangs and terrorist groups. It matters for promoting peace over war. And it matters for supporting democracy over authoritarianism. Monogamy matters, is my point. So I'll close with this quote from the author William Tucker in his book, Marriage and Civilization. He writes, "There is nothing completely natural about monogamy, which is why it is always so easy to undermine. Left to their natural state, almost all species end up practicing polygamy, since the strongest males will dominate the physically weaker males and females. Monogamy is the endpoint of civilized behavior that recognizes, however unconsciously, that enforcing the rules creates advantages at the societal level. If we want a society that satisfies everyone's most individualistic desires, we will not stick with monogamy for very long." Monogamy is one of the greatest gifts that Christianity has bestowed upon the world. But it is a fragile gift, and it requires careful tending. It matters almost more than we could know, and we have every reason to continue to passionately champion and honor it today. Thank you.